It is not your job to convince anyone to care about you. You matter whether they think so or not. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today revolves around Sri Lankan migrant workers with an emphasis on domestic workers who seek employment in the Middle East and other nations across the world. Are we doing enough? What are the laws in place? Or are they modern-day slaves who seek and sacrifice their future for you staying at home, for a better tomorrow for your children, for a better Sri Lanka, for a better economy? A few weeks ago, we saw the Bali Process taking center stage in Australia, where many leaders across the world, including business as well as civil rights activists, and also leaders from across the world, attending the conference in Perth. They united together to voice their concerns for a better tomorrow to all human beings who are seeking employment in other nations. Now, what is modern-day slavery? What impact does it create to those at home? And what impact does it create to those who seek employment? And are their rights being protected at the end of the day? To discuss all this and more, we have four eminent personalities in the studios this evening. Let me quickly introduce them to you. Joining us this evening is Swari Rupasinghe, National Program Officer on Labour Migration of the International Labour Organization. Nice to have you on board, Swari. Also joining us this evening as the Deputy General Manager of Training, Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, is Mangala Randhani. He was the former spokesperson of the Foreign Employment Bureau as well at one point. Nice to have you on board. Also joining us this evening is Dr. Blesha Ratna, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. Nice to have you as well on board. All joining us this evening, not on the panel of questionnaires, but sitting right there is Sonali Wanagabadgi, Attorney at Law and Manager of Corporate Affairs of Newsfirst, the Capital Maharaja organization. Nice to have you on board today as well, Sonali. Just a few weeks ago, we saw our very own Group Director of the Capital Maharaja organization, Siobhan Daniel, attending this conference. And he said three important priority areas were outlined at the conference. Those are ethical employment, transparency of supply chains, and safeguards and redress mechanism. It's all about creating a better tomorrow. And I'm very proud to say that it was an honor to have a Sri Lankan business delegate, a business leader, attending this conference in Perth and expressing concerns about a better future for these Sri Lankans who think that there is no future for them. Let's start off tonight's conversation with Swari Rupasinghe, National Program Officer on Labour Migration, International Labour Organization. Swari, tell us, what is modern-day slavery? We speak about slavery, we speak about this happening in the US for many, many years. Yep. And now again, we're discussing about modern-day slavery. Why?
Well, modern-day slavery actually happens at the recruitment stage, where people are deceived. They're given false promises. Deception actually is the main issue concern. And once people do get to their place of work, place of employment, they realize that the deception comes to fruition. They don't get the agreed wage. Their working conditions are very bad, inhumane in some cases. The laws of the countries that they work in sometimes don't include especially domestic workers in their labor laws, and this makes them more vulnerable to abuses of the employers, and we see this as complete infringement of their rights and entitlements. And this is actually the nexus between labor migration, forced labor, and human trafficking and slavery is so complicated, and there's a lot of gray areas in between. And at ILO, we've been in existence for more than 100 years, almost 100 years actually. Yes. And for us, it's about rights awareness, knowing people's entitlements, supporting governments to implement policies.
So in other words, you're trying to say that slavery exists even today?
In some forms. Not as we knew it 50, 60 years ago or beyond, but in modern ways in terms of deception. Yes, there is the fancy, flying and going to a new country, experiencing new things, but there are underlying sort of discriminations that take place and people's infringement of rights.
What are the countries that are most vulnerable as far as modern day slavery is concerned? And where does Sri Lanka stand in this whole equation?
I would say Middle Eastern countries, purely because of their culture, customs and laws. And a majority of Sri Lankans, especially lower skilled workers or domestic workers, they do end up going to the Middle East. Of course, we have Sri Lankans do go to other parts of the world where the salaries are better, working conditions are better. But the most amount of complaints that come through are from the countries of the Middle East.
When you say Middle East, what are the countries? Now, the Middle East is a gamut of countries. We're talking about many countries.
Yes.
What is the country in which you get the most number of complaints? Sorry.
I would say Saudi Arabia, and of course, we get in terms of looking at the most number of Sri Lankan migrants going to Qatar, Kuwait. I mentioned also Saudi Arabia. So I think those are the main countries we get the most amount of complaints from.
How important is it to have Muslims in these countries as ambassadors? Right? Do you think this helps the cause, or it doesn't?
Important. Extremely important, because they understand the culture better. They're able to form closer bonds with counterparts in the same countries, and they're in a better position in terms of language as well to speak on behalf of our workers.
Very quickly, before moving on to Sonali, you mentioned three countries. One is Qatar, one is Kuwait, and then Saudi Arabia. In Qatar right now, we have ASP Lienege, who is a former businessman, who is the ambassador in that country. Does it help the cause?
Well, it helps if there is someone who understands the issues of migrant workers better. It helps if someone who understands the policies, laws and practices within Sri Lanka and in those in Qatar, for example. So I can't really comment on the individual,
I agree.
but I would say what is best.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Swai Rupa Singh, National Program Officer on Labour Migration, ILO. I now move my attention to Sonali Vanagabadgan, Manager Corporate Affairs, Attorney at Law, as well as she's attached to Newsfirst and the Capital Maharaj organization. Sonali, just a few weeks ago, it was nice to see one of our very own group directors going to Perth, talking about how important modern day slavery is for a country like Sri Lanka, and the need to address these crimes that are taking place in the Middle East. It's important to see many world leaders getting together, business community getting together to arrest and address the problems at hand. What happened at the Bali process?
Yeah, Shamir, just as a precursor to that question, this time it was unique in the sense that not only governments were involved in this process, but also business leaders. So it was called the Bali Process Government and Business Forum 2017, which is why a large number of world leaders, foreign ministers, there were justice ministers, as well as leading business tycoons who got involved in this process. Because Shami, the thing is, in the traditional sense of the word, it is just governments who are considered main stakeholders. However, now the world is fast realizing that businesses also need to collaborate in order to bring about lasting, impactful change, because we are talking about millions and millions of employees and their rights being violated.
This is not only just an offense, it's a criminal offense. Now you being an attorney at law,
Yeah, that's
what must governments and business community really do to address this problem? You said that everyone should unite. What must they really do?
Shamir, it's important to have multi-stakeholder discussions. I think in countries like Sri Lanka especially, what we lack is a bottom-up approach. It is always, when we talk about legislation or implementation of legislation, it's always, it always comes from the top down. So citizenry or the masses at the lower rungs don't have any awareness on their rights, on their entitlements, on their responsibilities, which is why the majority end up being victimized. Just to give a definition to this word term modern slavery, it's in the business context, it includes all forms of human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and of course child labor. However, developed countries have recognized this, but it's a bit of a new term for developing countries. Just to give you an example of some of the countries that have sort of moved expeditiously towards recognizing this, there's the UK Modern Slavery Act of 2015, the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. These laws, Shamir, apply across all sectors and are designed to create a level playing field. But in Sri Lanka, we are eons away from even recognizing modern slavery, which is why it's really important that we create awareness about this fast-growing, terrible issue.
Sonali, you spoke of ensuring that there is a grassroots level awareness amongst the masses of Sri Lanka in terms of their travel to the Middle East and their seeking employment in the Middle East. How best can the business community get involved to create awareness?
Well, the business community getting involved, firstly, there has to be a streamlined, standardized process. Of course, we have a necessary legal framework in Sri Lanka. There's sufficient legislation. There's the Factories Ordinance. There's the Shop and Office Act. There are pieces of legislation which are effectively implemented. However, all the stakeholders need to come together in ensuring that these rights are protected and ensured and upheld. Also, what is not being done, Shamir, is that the employees don't have enough awareness of their rights and entitlements, and this is what we need to work towards.
Thank you very much, Sonali Vanigabadagir, Manager Corporate Affairs at the Capital Maharaja Organization. She's attached to Newsfirst as well. I now move my attention to Mangala Randhania, Deputy General Manager, Training, Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment. I want to drag your attention to a few years back to the 9th of January 2013. The capital punishment, the execution of Rizan and Nafiq, which kept somewhat a black mark as far as Sri Lanka is concerned the world over. There were many issues. They say that a forged passport was created. The government authorities failed to claim up to it and say, yes, there was a mistake committed. This came after 9 months after this incident took place initially. However, my question is very simple. What lessons have we learned since then, since 2013, 9th of January?
Well, when we look at that incident, which was really a black mark to the labour migration history in Sri Lanka, from the lessons learned, what the state and the Bureau of Foreign Employment wanted to do to introduce several barriers or several legal requirements like prerequisites for the female domestic sector workers. At that time, even we had the policy of national policy of labour migration, where one recommendation was given to introduce a minimum age for the female domestic workers. That was the 21, the age, the 21 was the recommendation. But going beyond that, having learned the lessons from that pathetic incidents, the government wanted to raise the minimum age from 21 to 23 for 23 for the Middle Eastern countries, but except the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. For Saudi Arabia, it was the 25. Now, the government is implementing this minimum wage law for the domestic sector workers, having understood that there should be maturity for the female to undertake this type of responsibility at the different destination. Since we do understand the workplace is a structured workplace, like it should be a formal work. If it is an employment, so there has to be a logically understood structured framework in the workplace. But when it comes to the domestic accommodation unit, which is now become now which is recognized as a workplace, but who are living inside the accommodation unit, the living ones, the residents do not recognize that as a workplace, because that's their living place. But the worker is going to a place where that has not been recognized as the workplace.
And Mangala,
then the contradiction comes.
I understand what the government has done in terms of increasing this age limit, which is very commendable. However, what about the training of these domestic workers?
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to explain that too. Then in 2013, we decided to introduce National Vocational Qualification Level 3 for the domestic sector housekeeping work. Traditionally, it was recognized as a so-called housemaid. But we wanted to give a different recognition for this particular category of workers leaving the country. And we all understand that that's the major category who earns and send the remittances to the country, because out of 1 million of Sri Lankan population, still the domestic female workers, the majority at the moment working and living in overseas. So we wanted to show them that there is a career, and to recognize that career, then there has to be a vocational qualification for that, first and foremost. With the Tertiary and Vocational Education Commission, the Bureau of Foreign Employment could introduce this National Vocational Qualification Level 3, where the 6th unit being taught. So the duration depends on the preliminary assessment of the candidates. Candidates being preliminarily assessed for their skills and the educational qualification and the literacy level. Those who do not have their mother tongue, those who can't read and write, they are being deployed for a 40-day residential training program, which has the component of teaching them the literacy, the basic literacy, like the numeric and reading and writing, and with the life skills. So that's the longest period we allocate for that particular crowd. Those who are capable in reading and writing, so they are being given a 21-day program, which is a residential training. Again, the assessment being done at the end of the training, that is to the level of National Vocational Qualification Level 3.
I have a very quick question before I move to Dr. Belisha. Mangala, are these restrictions imposed? You said 21, 23 and then 25. Are these restrictions imposed taking into account the family well-being of these migrant workers or their own safety?
The both sides being considered. To undertake such a responsibility at a destination country workplace, the one has to have a certain maturity and life experience of undertaking the role of domestic housekeeping. And when the empowerment level depends on the age of the person. So then that is personally benefited for the person to have more skilled and the bargaining power.
Thank you very much. Yes.
The both sides are there.
Right. Thank you very much, Mangala Randhaniya. He is now the Deputy General Manager Training, Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, but was also the former spokesperson of the Foreign Employment Bureau. I now move my attention to Dr. Belisha Weeraratne, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. Dr. Bilisha, I want to drag your attention to one of the articles that you wrote some time ago. This was in the year 2014. You said that, are restrictions imposed on female migrant workers discriminatory or improving family well-being? Now, what is your suggestion? Do you think it's a discriminatory move, or has it been done to ensure that the families back at home are looked after?
Well, it was introduced with very good and pure intentions of taking care of the well-being of the children and the family left behind. But we have to also think about the entire family unit, including the migrant herself in this case. So if a woman needs to find employment, and if she doesn't have an option in the country, is it fair to restrict her employment, or is it fair to restrict her opportunities to find employment overseas? That is where the discrimination plays in. So there's a fine balance that we have to strike in providing employment opportunities as well as taking care of the left behind family, especially the children at home.
Foreign remittances to the country had a dip in the year 2015, 6.8 billion US dollars. We saw that picking up in the year 2016, and even this year it will record somewhat of a good number. But the government has failed to even look after these individuals who are bringing in that money. There is no social security system in place for them. Their families, how their families are looked after are not taken into account, not taken into consideration. What sort of economic impact does it create in the long run?
To begin with, remittances play a huge role in the Sri Lankan economy. As you correctly said, in 2016 we had about 7.2 billion US dollars as remittances. So that foreign exchange that we get through remittances surpasses all other sources. Foreign exchange earned from tourism, from apparel exports, or even agriculture exports. So the remittance that comes into the country not only affects the family but the whole country, because we need foreign exchange to import our, let's say, cars or rice or whatever needs. So remittances are important for the whole country. In that sense, because the whole country benefits from the remittances that the migrant brings in, it's a collective responsibility to take care of the migrant who brings in all these remittances. So there are some efforts taken. There are insurance schemes, and the family background report itself tries to protect the well-being of the family, but there is still more that can be done. In my opinion, what can be done is especially to help the migrant worker to manage the remittances that comes into the family, because there is a situation of where the migrant who earns the money is out of the country, but the people who are spending the money is within the country. So the migrant doesn't have full control of how the money is spent at home. So she might be working so hard and collecting money, but sometimes it happens that when they come back, there's no money left. So in that sense, I think the government or the regulators can play a role to ensure that there is better remittance management at home while the migrant is abroad.
Dr. Bilisha, just after your article that I just mentioned about in the year 2014, then in 2015 you write another article. You say, upfront incentives, carrot for migrants and cash to others. Now I'm trying to think, that's a very pessimistic statement, isn't it? Carrot for migrant workers, we say the carrot stick approach sometimes works, but carrot absolutely is nothing. And then the cash goes to someone else, probably the government, like the foreign remittances that we're talking about right now, and the agencies who are earning the big bucks, isn't it? There's a lot of stakeholders involved in the recruitment process. So roughly about $5,000 come into Sri Lanka to finance for the recruitment process of a domestic worker. So out of that, the formal agent gets a commission, the informal sub-agent gets a commission, and also an upfront incentive is paid for the migrant and the family members. So why I say it's like a carrot is because most often how the mechanism works is that not the entire upfront incentive is paid before the migrant leaves. Most often the last portion of this incentive is dispersed after the migrant worker boards the flight. So then she has little control over what is given. So this
carrot is dangled for her to get into the flight and go so that everybody gets their commission, but then she has little say over how it is managed back at home. If your family is good, you have a good chance of it being, saved and properly invested. But then if your family doesn't have that proper remittance management plan, then
so where does the government come into play here in this whole equation? Do you think that the government has a role to play to ensure that this is more streamlined and the migrant worker, him or herself, has an opportunity to get access to that money and not just the carrot that is just dangling over the head or face?
There are various initiatives taking place right now itself. On the one hand, there's a lot of effort to regulate the informal sub-agents. So informal sub-agent means we have licensed agencies who are allowed to recruit workers for foreign employment, but there is also a sub-layer informally operating at the grassroots level, scouting potential migrants, called sub-agents. So because there was little regulation over them, a lot of malpractices have taken place. So now the government is trying to bring them into the formal framework and link them up with the licensed agents and have some control over their operation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilish Veeraratna, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. Let me quickly introduce them to you. On to my immediate left is Charita Fernando, who is also an assistant manager for Biz First. On to my far left is Nadim Majid. So I open the floor for questions. Let's start off with Charita.
Thank you, Shamir. My first question is to Dr. Bilisha. Now we've seen a sort of a downturn in the Middle East due to low oil prices. Has that affected the demand for labor from this part of the region?
A little bit of a decline in the demand also, because we had a nice growth trend in total departures, but it has dropped during the last couple of years. Last year it was only 243,000 departures. Previous year we had more than that, and 2014 I think we had over 300,000 migrants. So there was a small decline related to this oil prices, and also there has been more of an impact on remittances sent also because of that. So we are feeling a little bit much, but there were certain changes taking place within the composition of the departures also, so that would have compensated a little bit of the remittances as well as the employment situation, because earlier we were very much focused on low skilled workers, but now there is a very incipient trend of better skilled people going, so maybe that compensates a little bit.
Yeah, let's focus a bit more on the composition of departures. Do you see a trend of less female workers migrating to the Middle East as housemaids, and more of male workers taking up employment in the Middle East or even South Korea?
Definitely.
And if that is so, how has it changed the remittance situation?
Definitely, there has been a gender reversal in departures. So now it's majority. Until very recently, it was females who were dominating the departures, and now it's males who are dominating. So with this changing gender composition, there's lots of impact on the remittances, but still we don't know. We have not tested, but what I feel right now is, because on the onset we know that females are more connected to the family than a woman, than a man. So then literature always says that remittances from females are more reliable and they will be more connected. But men, on the other hand, sorry to say, are considered to be less regular in their remittances and less connected to the family. So because of that, there can be a change in remittances. But on the other hand, most of the Sri Lankan men who go abroad go for better jobs with better pay. So when they do remit, they have a chance of remitting much more than a woman might have remitted regularly over time. So still we don't know which way the balance is going to tip.
You made the statement looking at Mangala, so I'm going to pose a question to Mangala. Mangala, you've been in that situation. You know what migrant workers go through. And Berisha brought in a very important point about not giving an upfront incentive to the migrant worker in question. She only knows when she gets into the plane as to how much she is going to get, and she doesn't have any control over it subsequently. And that is why the men at home have a nice ride spending that money that the woman is earning overseas. Now, Do you all have a proper plan, a mechanism to address this problem at hand?
Of course, we haven't understood this every situations, like what does of course the male doing at home and their contribution towards family well-being, and the female's contribution towards family well-being. But fortunately for the both side, we have female. If female is leaving the country for employment, she earns and sends. What we do promote is to have their own accounts prior to departure, because everyone must have that right whose labor is being spent and the ownership to the capital should be with them. But we have a lot of cultural discussions and socio-cultural situation affecting this particular.
Do you all have a plan in place?
Yeah, because at the pre-departure level, we necessarily open their own accounts. The departing female workers' personal accounts being opened and the details being given to the employer to remit those money to their account. So then that money being served, and they have been educated in financially, the financial literacy that is taking place in the pre-departure level for them to give the standing orders or to remit some portion to their family.
Mangala, I have a question
expenses.
to you. I have a question to you. Now, those days I recollect, whenever a domestic worker goes overseas, he or she gets paid. That's the normal format. The agency pays this individual money. But nowadays, it's completely different. When a domestic worker seeks employment overseas, in any job, in particular, let's say a Sri Lankan migrant worker who's seeking overseas employment, he or she has to pay a X number of amount to the agency in question. Why is that?
No, it's a different situation now.
What is the situation?
Yeah, that's right. The Bureau of Foreign Employment, the Act of the Bureau of Foreign Employment was amended in 2009 as number 59. So in that one, the agents was given the authority, or they are permitted to charge the approved SLBFE approved amount for their expenses. But we have banned charging from the domestic worker, especially the Middle Eastern countries. The SLBFE is having the evidences, and we have all type of information.
But why must the migrant worker pay the agency? Isn't it should be the other way around?
Should be, but in some job opportunities, some category of job opportunities available in the destination countries, the agent has to spend some money to get those job orders to our country.
But the agents most often than not request 2 months' salaries, 3 months. I can give you ample examples for this. You go to Kurunegala, speak to a few agents, go as a migrant. I did this on Sunday. Because I was coming to this show today, I went on Sunday to Kurunegala. I spoke to a few agencies. You know what they told me? They said, good, you look okay, you can go and do some work in the Middle East, but you need to pay us 2 months' salary. And I was thinking to myself, this was not the case before. And what is the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment doing about it?
Even before, at the very beginning of this industry, like 1977, when the open economy was the open to the Sri Lankan the country, Sri Lanka. So what has happened? Even the domestic worker, though the pre-departure cost was borne by the employers, some agents have charge from, or the charge from the worker. But once the SLBFE was established in 1985, then having understood all the situation in the labor migration process, the agents were not supposed to charge.
But they're charging now.
Now, for the domestic sector, the licensed agents can't charge. Domestic
but they're
sector,
charging now.
No, domestic sector, Middle Eastern countries.
But they are charging now.
They don't
I'm telling
charge.
you with responsibility.
They can't charge.
They are charging now.
No, they are charging only for the approved job opportunities. The approved job opportunities by the Bureau of Foreign Employment.
Right. Thank you very much, Mangala.
Swari,
yes.
how big of a problem are these agencies? I mean, if the jobs that these people are being forced into are modern day slavery, then these agents are basically the slave brokers.
Well, as Bilesha said, there are two categories. There's the licensed foreign employment agents, and there's also the intermediaries or the sub-agents. And we've seen irregular recruitment activity on both parts. This issue is huge in terms of the varying recruitment costs charged from men and how it differs to women. It differs to different countries, and of course there is a sustainable development goal in terms of reducing the recruitment cost to zero. So it's a challenge, I think, for Sri Lanka, because currently the legislation talks of charging a registration fee, and that applies to all categories
Is the regulatory
of workers.
framework in Sri Lanka right now, is it sufficient to
There's a
stop
national
these
policy.
agencies from doing?
There is a national policy on labor migration.
Is it being implemented?
It is. In fact, ILO's main role is to help government, employers and workers implement this national labor migration policy. In fact, we are also going through a process of reviewing it and updating it, because it was passed by the cabinet in 2009. And the sector is so dynamic that a lot of things have changed.
How does it work with law enforcement? Is there engagement with law enforcement in taking down agents or agencies that violate these regulations?
Yes, there is. The Foreign Employment Bureau has an anti-trafficking unit. The CID has an anti-trafficking unit. And we've seen over the period of the previous year, the investigations have increased. So more people are reporting. Not enough still. More people need to report incidences of trafficking. Yes, investigations are being done, but I think the weakest area is in terms of how the cases are recorded by the police and how the prosecutions take place.
When it comes to enforcing the law against these agencies, that rogue agencies, would you say that corruption is widespread? And that is one of the reasons that we're not seeing cases against agencies being brought to court and agencies being...
Yes, because in the current law there is no word called sub-agents or intermediaries. Therefore, and also these people work as under a tree kind of operations, and you try to find them, they give you bogus addresses.
So it's outside the formal...
So it is definitely outside the formal legal mechanism, and they're very difficult to catch. And this is why, as Bilesha said, the government is trying to find a way to regulate the sub-agents as well.
Sonali, we were talking about the Bali process. So what were the key outcomes that was discussed for governments and businesses?
Mainly 4 outcomes, Charita. Very briefly, the first is ethical recruitment. This is especially relevant to a country, a developing country such as Sri Lanka, where businesses acknowledge that migrant workers are more vulnerable towards being exploited, especially due to a lack of education, linguistic barriers, less negotiating power, such as what our migrant workers going to the Middle East face. Secondly, supply chain transparency. The need has been recognized for consistent standards and laws being essential to level the playing field across the region and to improve transparency across multi-tiered supply chains. Thirdly, incentives. This is to develop regional incentives which encourage and reward ethical business behavior. So this is especially important for businesses, and talks about a change in corporate culture. Fourthly, to develop innovative mechanisms to promote regional safeguards for victims and to improve the access to redress and grievance mechanism across the region. This is for those who have been victimized as a result of modern day slavery.
So what's the mechanism like to spearhead those initiatives, say in Sri Lanka? How are we going to
Great question.
drive those? Yeah.
So after the Bali process talks concluded, what each individual state will then have to do is to take it back to their country and bring in ideally bring in enabling legislation. For example, in a dualist country such as ours, we would require enabling legislation to implement those proposals or those mechanisms which were discussed. However, instead of bringing in enabling legislation at different levels, businesses can come together, other agencies can come together, different stakeholders can come together, collaborate and agree on guidelines which can then be implemented across the board in businesses.
Swari, I have a report by the US State Department. This was released this year on trafficking in person. It's called the Trafficking in Persons Report. Now it says the government of Sri Lanka does not fully meet the minimum standards for elimination of trafficking. However, it is making significant efforts to do so. So they've highlighted several aspects. The report says at times the government's inconsistent identification of victims resulted in the penalization of victims for prostitution and for immigration violations committed as a result of the victim's subjection to trafficking. The government provided no specialized services to male victims and sometimes housed child victims in government detention centers. The government maintained specific requirements for migration for female migrant workers, including those migrating for domestic work, which observers stated increased the likelihood of women migrate illegally and therefore heighten their vulnerability to human trafficking. Who is tackling this side of the problem in Sri Lanka?
Well, Justice Ministry leads on issues of trafficking. There's a national task force on human trafficking where ILO is an observer, but it consists of national level ministries like the Labour Ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Employment, the Ministry of Women and Child Affairs, and each of them have a role to play in terms of there's a national strategic action plan on combating human trafficking. And there are also various civil society organizations and partners who are also working on it. But of course the main responsibility is with the Justice Ministry.
How serious is this problem?
It is serious in the sense trafficking and forced labor happens in so many different forms. Sometimes people themselves don't realize they're in a situation of trafficking. Therefore, reporting does not take place. In most cases, as I said before, the investigations does not take place. The reason why the prosecutions don't take place is sometimes, despite having a penal code section 360C on prosecuting for human trafficking offences, a lot of the offences are charged based on procurement, which is 360A. So they're not really punished on trafficking offences, and as a result it doesn't get counted as a traffic case or a conviction.
So could you give us some examples, like what kind of case studies have you come across related to trafficking?
Simply recruitment. A person is deceived in terms of the salary that they're getting, the country that they're working in. Once they go to the destination, the salary is much less. They have to also spend for their meals and their medical expenses. So in terms of various forms, there is the deception part, there's the transportation part. So many things take place along the way that contributes to the process of trafficking.
Mr. Randhania, the agency that was responsible for sending Rizana Nafiq overseas, were they charged with trafficking?
Yeah, they were charged for trafficking, and their entire ban means no permission to start any agency. The agency is totally, the clause means is the punishment was given. They said.
What about punishment in the courts? Is anyone aware of whether there was any sentencing, any legal recourse?
But what we took on the institutional basis, the Bureau of Foreign Employment, within the power that the Bureau of Foreign Employment is having, so that was cancelled. Now, that licensee or their relatives can open any foreign employment recruitment agency in the country. So that's the punishment given by the Bureau of Foreign Employment for that particular incident.
And so in terms of the judiciary, or what's the punishment for human trafficking?
It's the same as rape. It's I think a minimum of 20 years, and
what was the punishment that was given to this agency that was responsible for
Nadeem, I don't think you can ask that question on Swahili because she represents the ILO. We can probably ask Mangal the same question. What sort of action has been taken?
What sort of punishment?
That's only the institutional action, because
so there has been no action in the courts. That, I mean, they've lost their license. They can no longer function.
No longer function.
It sounds like the government. You have resignations by ministers, but no proper investigations or.
It's like the resignations by ministers. It stops with the resignation.
That's a different case, because for that, when we reveal the case of Rizwan and Afiq, the parties involved in who is responsible for giving a forged passport? Is it who has produced this forged document to get the forged passport? Who is responsible? So there are a lot of responsibilities to be fixed.
So there are
for
multiple
several parties
crimes that have been committed.
What
there,
the
starting with the
SLBF could
falsification
do, of
documents.
course, to ban forever, lifetime ban.
But honestly, Nadeem, I don't hold Mangal accountable for it, because you have a minister from the former regime who had 2 passports and is still having a gala time in parliament. So I don't blame Mangal for that. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka justice system is that. Dr. Bilesha, why are Sri Lankan migrant workers so vulnerable? Now, there are so many migrant workers. Let's talk about the Filipinos, for an example. There are no reported incidents like this. Why are Sri Lankan migrant workers so vulnerable?
Philippines has a very strong system that supports their workers. As far as I know, if there is one pending case of some issue regarding a migrant worker, until it's solved, they don't proceed to send the next batch of workers. But that doesn't happen in the case of Sri Lanka. And also, the majority of Sri Lankan migrants, again we come back to the compositional issue, are low-skilled workers. Low-skilled workers are from the most marginalized groups in the society. So they are not all that equipped to handle vulnerable situations or to avoid such situations. Despite all the training that we give, they have that deficit within them. So there's a limit that you can catch up with the training to make them better prepared to handle a vulnerable situation and avoid them. But there is certain things that we can't handle also. So
but do we have a commitment from the government agencies to ensure that they're properly trained? Now, Mangala said there is a 40-day residential training program for migrant workers who cannot speak or who cannot read or write, who can speak obviously, but who can't read and write. So there is a 4-day residential training program, and now there is government regulation stating that less than 21 years you can't go to a country to do domestic work, and in Saudi Arabia the number has been pushed to 25. But are all these good enough? My question is, are the rights of these domestic workers at the end of the day protected? They don't even know what their rights are at the end of the day, as Sonali correctly pointed out.
to a large extent that is also a problem, because they, as I said, they are from the marginalized groups. So they think they have to bear up anything that come across them, and they think this is what we came here for, so let's just stomach it and get through this. But if they are better aware of their rights, they might be able to report it. But then again, most of our workers are domestic workers, until recently, or low-skilled workers. So though we don't have a large proportion of female domestic workers right now, what happens to female domestic workers is like what we were discussing before. They go into a household, so their employer is a household, and in most of these Middle East countries, a household or an employer in a household is not recognized as a formal employer. So the labor laws don't apply within the household for the domestic worker who's working.
But there is an ILO regulation, 189 of the ILO convention, very clearly states that if there is a domestic worker who is going overseas, there has to be a contract of employment, a written job offer.
Of course, that's available.
There are, but most often there are many things happen after they leave the country. There are things.
But all this is just paper. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes and no.
Can I add?
Okay, now there is a law by the ILO which says there has to be a written job offer.
Yes.
And what are you all doing about it?
See, number one, we support the country in ratifying these conventions, but with international labor standards, they also have to be reciprocal. So in the case of a country of destination, if they have ratified the convention, then we are able to request our diplomatic mission officers perhaps to go to the household. But of course, in Sri Lanka's case, Sri Lanka also hasn't ratified Convention 189 on domestic workers.
It's quite unfortunate, Mangala. You know, we have not signed the convention, or ratified the convention in question, but we're talking about the rights of our domestic workers at the end of the day.
Domestic workers at the destination countries. Yeah, that issue is in front of the state. Still, the ILO is doing a lot of the lobbying and promoting the relevant the ministry to ratify domestically. Then we can say to the destination country that domestically as a country we have ratified, and now we have to...
Are we waiting until another Rizal Nafi case happens to ratify such a important piece of legislation?
No, some developments are being taken place in the destination country also. For example, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2014, we signed a special MOU only for the domestic sector workers. In that one, the technical support was taken to introduce the agreement, job agreement, and that is an attachment to this MOU signed between the Labour Minister and the Foreign Employment Minister in Sri Lanka. So there are technical discussions taking place by now in terms of implementing to see the full implementation of this MOU with the design the agreement. So when it comes to the fully implementation of this MOU with the agreement, then the workplace at the destination country in Saudi Arabia is recognized as a workplace. So then we might be able to ensure the more protection for the workers.
But right now the government strategy is, let's wait until the milk is built and then try talking about it after everything happens.
No, the thing is, it's
a very reactive approach, isn't it?
What has traditionally happened in our country, I need to explain a little more about why the Sri Lankan females domestic workers are less empowered compared to the Filipino domestic worker. Because country has not, of course, doing any promotional work openly for the domestic sector work. But in Philippines, if you study properly, we can see they don't say something like that. They do promote their workers. They do promote, and they have given a lot of the pre-departure level orientations and training, not at the decision-making level, but even at the pre-education, like when they were in the education, a lot of promotional programs, and they have been promoted to reach the vocational qualifications, and their education system is more towards employment, not like Sri Lanka. Here we say openly, we don't promote domestic sector workers leaving the country. We don't want our Sri Lankan females to leave the country. Then no one is making any effort to achieve any kind of an extra skill.
Thank you very much.
Facing those challenges.
Thank you very much, Mangala. I want to pose a very quick question to Sonali before we move on to a short commercial break. One of the three top priority areas that was discussed at the Bali process was safeguards and redress mechanisms. Sonali, how important is it to have these mechanisms in place? The ILO convention, for an example, it has to be ratified. Then Mangala just spoke about saying that we don't have domestic workers going overseas as a top priority area. But at the end of the day, the government has failed to realize that $7.2 billion coming from these migrant workers who are going to these countries, earning their money and sending it back. How important is it to have laws?
It's essential to have laws, Shamir, but more than that, the more important reason is that we need proper implementation mechanisms. We can have all the laws in the world, but if they are not properly implemented, then that amounts to an absolute failure. So for this, again we move on to the efficaciousness and effectiveness of the law enforcement authorities on the one hand, and the victims who need to be then made aware of their rights, responsibilities and entitlements.
Sonali, Mangal just spoke about those who cannot read and write, who come to the Foreign Employment Bureau seeking employment. Now, how can you tell these people, individuals who come to seek Foreign Employment Bureau, look here, these are your rights? They won't even properly understand what you're talking about. They'll be like, okay, I understand, I want to go overseas. And that's all what you hear from them.
This is exactly why we need a paradigm shift in attitude, and this can only be brought about if we reform our education system, if we better our education system.
Right. Thank you very much, Sonali, for your thoughts. We go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's Face the Nation. We are talking about the plight of Sri Lankan migrant workers and modern day slavery. Stay connected. Stay with Face the Nation. Welcome back. You're with Face the Nation. I now move my attention to Swari Rupasinghe, National Program Officer on Labour Migration, or the ILO. Swari, one of the criticisms leveled against the ILO is the fact that you all are singling out certain countries. When you really look at the last 5 years per se, this is very evident. Why am I saying this? Let's talk about Qatar for an example. In the year 2013, your report said that Qatar failing on forced labor. You all continue with your reports, and the latest report came on the 22nd of March 2017, which says Qatar given a deadline to end abuse of migrant workers or face investigation. Now, this is one of the reports that was published by the International Labour Organization. It continues to talk about how deplorable states in which migrant workers are living in Qatar. But you don't see this situation when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia. Why?
In the case of Qatar especially, it's because of the Football World Cup.
Absolutely, FIFA World Cup, that's right.
And also the requirement of FIFA for ILO to give a report on labor standards in that country.
Okay, let me rephrase that question. Why not other countries? Saudi Arabia, you just mentioned that it's not a safe place for migrant workers to go, and there needs to be more strict regulations and laws. Yeah. But what is the ILO doing?
For one, ILO does work with migrant workers in all these countries. But sometimes, in the case of Qatar also, I think the government has to allow a delegation to come in and study these situations.
So I can say that the Saudi government is not allowing ILO representatives to come to their country? But you
have to be invited also to come in and
look at
the situation. We do not have an office in Saudi Arabia. We do have a regional office based in Lebanon that covers our work in all the Middle Eastern countries, Northern African and Middle Eastern countries.
But never have you seen in the UN system talking about the deplorable state in which these migrant workers are living. We are going to Geneva, we have a Human Rights Commission, not talking about labor issues in the world. They talk about human rights. What about these 21 million people who are bringing back money to their countries in question? My question is very simple. What is the ILO doing about all this and more?
We do work in the Middle Eastern region. We've developed guidelines and recruitment principles where we're supporting governments, especially in the recruitment sector, but also to promote fair migration. We are working with employers' organizations, workers' organizations, trade unions. As you know, ILO is a tripartite. And the decisions we make is a collective decisions made by this collective body. Perhaps it's not getting highlighted in the media, and this is unfortunate. But we do work with different countries in the Middle Eastern region, especially where workers are facing difficulties.
What sort of concrete action has the organization been able to take over the last few years? I'm talking about, in particular, the three countries you mentioned. You mentioned about Qatar, you mentioned about Kuwait, and you mentioned about Saudi Arabia. Tell me, what sort of concrete action has your organization been able to take?
Number one, I would say, is to inform people within Sri Lanka or within countries of origin that go to work in those countries. So information is very important, awareness is very important, and in the case of human trafficking and forced labor, as I said, prevention is very important. We do engage with other organizations working in those countries, civil society organizations, where trade unions are active. We have bilateral agreements with trade unions in Sri Lanka, and we promote those discussions. We have regional consultative processes like the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, the Colombo Process, where there is a forum which we technically support along with the International Organization of Migrants, to come to an agreement in terms of minimum standards for employment, skills recognition, learning from good practices, and also in the sense of putting pressure on countries of destination by countries of origin. So there's a lot happening regionally and globally in terms of
not having an office in these countries in question. Is it really worthwhile to exert so much of pressure? Because I know for a fact that the ILO has took a very firm stand when the Rizal and Nafiq issue took place. Many organizations, many countries across the world took a very firm stand. But tough luck. 2013, January 9th, we saw the execution of that poor lady, poor young girl. Nothing we could do about it.
Of course, that situation is very unfortunate. It hasn't meant that we've stopped working. As I said earlier, labor migration, forced labor and trafficking is very complex. It requires countries to work with their partners in country as well as counterparts in countries of destination, and this is the only way that we can exert some pressure, especially through our diplomatic missions, who are expected to establish partnerships with their counterparts, service providing organizations in those countries, and build trust. It's not something that will happen overnight. Lots of work needs to continue to be done.
Thank you very much.
Several stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Sri Rupa Singh, a National Program Officer on Labour Migration. I now move attention to Dr. Bilesha Veeratna, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes many, many years. I want to drag your attention to the story with regard to Indonesia. 2011, the Indonesian Parliament decided that they won't send maids to the Middle East. This decision just happened overnight. They took a firm stand, and this is in effect even now to Saudi Arabia. Indonesia has stopped sending maids. What is really required? A firm stand to ensure that countries unite and say, guess what, we won't tolerate this, and hence we will not send our maids. Is it all practical? Because right after Rizal Nafiq's incident took place in Saudi Arabia, I recollect many countries, in particular Sri Lankans, were saying, let's put a complete stop to sending maids to Saudi Arabia. Can that practically happen in a country like Sri Lanka, where our foreign remittances, we depend on foreign remittances, and we can't really do it, can we?
No, I don't think that's practical for two reasons. As you correctly said, we rely heavily on the remittances, and on the other hand, we also, labor migration provides, releases the labor market pressure within the country. It takes away like nearly 250,000 people every year. So imagine if those people were also competing for jobs within the country, what would happen to our unemployment rate? So if we are to put a ban on labor migration for one sector, one occupation or one gender, we have to provide sufficient alternative opportunities within the country. So most of these people are migrating not just for the sake of migrating. They've explored a lot of opportunities back at home, and they were not viable for their livelihood, so that's why they had to leave. So before we put something, a ban of such in place, it's critically important to evaluate the alternative opportunities available at home. We already see that with the family background report.
Right, Belisha, now I am in agreement with Swairi's statement with regard to nothing happens overnight, it takes time. Does the government at the end of the day, the respective governments that has come into play, do they have the political will to create the background for these individuals to seek employment in Sri Lanka itself? Have you seen this happening?
To some extent it has happened, but there's a lot more to be done. There are efforts to create employment opportunities. There are efforts to build skills in these people so that they can find alternative opportunities. But still, there's a lot more to be done.
What is the government doing about these individuals? We have been talking about a social security system for these individuals who are bringing money to the country, in particular a pension for these individuals in question. Day in, day out, every year we hear at the budgets that the governments are trying and planning to make opportunities for these individuals in terms of a pension scheme. Nothing has been done, and you cannot certainly expect that from the government which is in play, because they're already bankrupt. They don't even have money to service their debts at the end of the day. How can we do this? Pensions, is that possible?
I don't want to tread onto that, but let me twist it in a different way and say, so social security for migrant workers can be achieved collectively with all countries, sending and receiving countries. Right now the global compact for migration is also in effect, and it's also looking at collaborating with all countries on migration governance. So if all countries, sending and receiving countries, work together to ensure social security and portability of social security across sending and receiving countries, things can be achieved, not overnight, not alone as a single country, so collectively.
I'm posing this question to you, why, Dr. Belisha? The reason is, every single time there comes an election in Sri Lanka, you hear stories like this, because you know there are a lot of dependent families, those who have the voting rights in the estate sector in particular. You see this happening in the eastern province, you see politicians making statements. So what you're saying is, all this takes time, it cannot be done overnight. Am I right?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Belisha Weeraratne, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. Next time a politician comes to your doorstep and says, guess what, we're going to give you a pension scheme for the migrant worker who is working in the Middle East, think twice. I now move my attention to Mangal Randenia, Deputy General Manager Training, Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment. All the statements that Swairi mentioned, what Dr. Belisha mentioned so far, points the finger at the government. What have you all done concretely to address the problems at hand? We're talking about human rights, we're talking about the rights of migrant workers, we're talking about their remittances, and I'm quite surprised that you're telling in this panel today that the government is not thinking domestic workers working overseas as a priority. Have they got their priorities right in the first place as far as these foreign remittances are concerned? The time starts now.
Yes. Now, I'm representing the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, and we are under the Ministry of Foreign Employment. So the whole task, the objective of the Bureau of Foreign Employment is to promote safe and planned labor migration in the country. So what we have done, from the point that you raise the incident, the pathetic incident, and you were talking about why not Sri Lanka couldn't make a full stop to the female domestic worker. In 2013, of course, we wanted to give a good decision, or take a good decision, like introducing one is family background report to reduce the female migration. Second one is the increase in the training duration and reaching to the NVQ level 3, and the several age barriers. Having introduced all these three main pre-departure mandatory prerequisites, we could reduce the number of females leaving the country. The the indirect objective of this particular exercise was to have a complete diversification from the female job seekers, like at the age of 18 or just pass out the school. No one can then think of leaving the country for domestic work. Then they have to go for an alternative vocational training program to get different type of a vocational skills to go abroad or to get an employment local. So we had an 2013 MOU with the Ministry of Vocational Training to introduce alternative occupations, alternative the vocational training programs for female sector workers. That worked to a certain extent, but I don't say that it was fully worked, but we need to make effort. Still we are making a joint effort with the vocational training system, vocational training authority and the TVEC to introduce alternative job opportunities, alternative vocational training for the domestic sector prospective females, like domestic sector caregivers. We recently introduced National Vocational Qualification Level 3 for the caregiver occupation. Now the trend is, we are experiencing in the trend, the most of the applicants, the reach in the Bureau of Foreign Employment to get this vocational training program, to get involved in the vocational training program, which is the domestic caregiving, is not the domestic housekeeping, towards other destinations. So it's a possible and a positive sign in terms of the diversification.
Mangala, you speak about the programs that are in place as far as developing and training housemaids or domestic workers who are seeking employment overseas. You said very proudly about the NVQ program that has been launched with the assistance of the Ministry of Vocational Training. However, this still does not address the problem at hand. We saw December 23rd, 2015, Saudi Arabia reducing the death sentence of a female housemaid who was sentenced to death by stoning for adultery to a simple jail term.
Yeah.
What did the embassy officials do? They went and misguided this housemaid in question, and then this housemaid in question went and again testified something very similar that happened in the Rizan Afiq incident. Isn't it important to have a legal counsel in these embassies? Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, as I mentioned before. Isn't it important? Someone is ill-advising our housemaids, and we are talking about Sri Lankans at the end of the day. It seems that the government who is in power, the Foreign Employment Bureau as well, don't even care what happens to them. That's the state of affairs in Sri Lanka right now, unfortunately, Mangala.
I have my reservation, and
yes,
because it's entirely consular affairs. We are dealing with the labor matters. We have the labor section in the mission, but when it comes to the civil activities or the civil affairs of the Sri Lankans living abroad, it's entirely to be handled by the consular division.
No, isn't it important to have a legal officer?
The Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment is always spending for legal counseling and legal advisors, and from this point, of course, what we learn from this incident, we are given a full awareness at the pre-departure level, the laws, regulations, and the legal procedures and things at the destination country to the migrant workers. So they are going with the particular certain understanding, but that understanding alone does not support for migrant worker to get the empowered position, to bargain, but the supports to be given by the government.
Someone who can't read and write, how would a piece of paper do any good?
Yeah, there are very few those who can't read and write, but a
you
majority.
Said there is a 4-day program, in-house residential training program for those who can't read and write. So all these who can't read and write,
they are being taught to a certain extent their literacy. The mother tongue is being taught the section is that there is special section.
I'm sure, Mangala, you all must be telling them, if there is something, if you commit a wrongdoing, please don't go to the embassy.
The literacy is not just reading and writing, but getting and correct information to their mind and informing them what to do and informing them to take the good decision. So those information can be given through an awareness for the people, though they can't read and write. But that crowd is very minimum by now.
Yeah.
But the lot can read and write their mother tongue, but the foreign languages, of course, they can't read and write.
Absolutely,
but the only thing is knowing the correct information. That's the important thing.
I think, Mangala, taking into account what happened in Saudi Arabia during the recent past, you must be advising the housemaids, don't even go to the embassy.
Of course,
if there is an incident.
That's the message there again. Even we have issued instruction leaflets for our training instructors
so you all say,
pronounce it.
You all say the housemates to go to the embassy. If there is a problem, just go to them directly, right? Correct
Go to the embassy and meet the labor section officials.
Okay.
And they are also now being trained.
Can they contact the Foreign Employment Bureau in the event something of that sort happens? Can they speak to your agency or commission officials to get some redress? Is that on the cards? Can they do it?
Yeah, the telephone numbers, contact persons, the details, everything is given.
Is that a toll-free number? Can they call from anywhere in the world without a cost?
Not yet by now, but
you are working on it.
Yeah, majority. Right. And we have a 24-hour call-in center in the SLBFE.
What's that number, if I may ask?
That is 18.
18?
Yeah, this is the 1989 is the number for 24-hour call-in center.
Right. Yes. Thank you very much.
1989.
Thank you very much, Mangala, for your thoughts, for your comments on the third round. I now move my attention to our very own attorney at law, Sonali Vanagabadge. Where can these housemaids turn into when they're at redress? They're facing a problem. Do they have a shoulder to cry on at the end of the day when something goes wrong? Your time starts now.
In addition to the measures that the other panelists mentioned, Shamir, some of the concerns that I'd like to raise are the fact that there's sometimes wrongful imprisonment. There is no means of communication made available to the migrant worker. Families in Sri Lanka go on for months on end without any form of communication from the migrant worker. Once they are finally in Sri Lanka, of course the legal process in Sri Lanka kicks in. However, what needs to be established moving forward is that there needs to be state-to-state understanding at a stronger level. This is why bargaining power is necessary. If as one country we don't have enough of bargaining power to negotiate with say Middle Eastern countries, then that is where processes such as the Bali process comes into play, because we're talking about 45 countries, businesses, states in the Indo-Pacific region coming together to fight against modern slavery. So convergence and coming together is of paramount importance, Shamir. But
so we're talking about safeguards and redress. Is it the same thing, or is it two different things in the eyes of a domestic worker who's seeking employment overseas?
Safeguards, in the sense at a local municipal level, it is the responsibility of the necessary stakeholders, including the government, to ensure the necessary information is disseminated to the migrant worker before he or she leaves the country, mainly female workers. However, redress mechanisms are used after whatever victimization takes place. So
it's important to have safeguards.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
But do you think that the government at hand has been able to bring that out and inform the people, make the grassroots cognizant about what is happening?
Well, Shamir, with regard to, I can answer with regard to the work we've done here at Newsfirst over the past 12 years that I've been involved in the organization, and all the stories that we've covered of migrant workers who have been harassed, abused, raped, maimed, and sometimes killed also as a result of their helplessness, the hopelessness, and the lack of necessary frameworks to ensure and protect their rights. As to that capacity, I can answer that question to say absolutely not. And Shamir, here's what I think. If and unless there is a paradigm shift in the thinking, if it's my mother who is going to the Middle East as a domestic worker, then I would care. That is the attitude that we need to change. Why don't we care about our migrant workers? Why don't the state agencies care? Is it because the government bodies, the politicians, the elected politicians are too busy lining their pockets? There's so much white collar crime, so much corruption that we report on a daily basis. However, these migrant workers' rights are not looked into. This is the same thing that we've been talking about day in, day out, year on year. Every day we talk about this issue, but the response is the same. So we need to think of more innovative ways. Now, at the Bali process, one of the matters that was discussed was ensuring that these migrant workers also have access to modern tools of communication, such as WhatsApp, Facebook, social media. Right? These are some of the ways that we can look at this same old problem in a new way. But of course, having said that, the government needs to actually care.
Thank you very much, Sonali Wanagabal, Manager Corporate Affairs, Newsfirst. I open the floor for questions from our journalists, but before that, very quickly, Mangala, your number 1989 works. So that's good news as far as the Foreign Employment Bureau is concerned. As soon as you mentioned the number 1989 saying that it's a 24-hour hotline, I quickly call them to check whether it's working, because whatever information we give to our listeners and viewers who are watching us tonight should be credible, and you won the battle as far as 1989 is concerned. It works. So I open the floor for questions. Let's start off with Charita.
Thank you, Shamir. My question is for Mr. Randeniya. In 2012, the Cabinet approved a migrant health policy, and then in 2015, the Ministry of Foreign Employment launched a sub-policy and a national action plan on return and reintegration of Sri Lankan migrant workers. Is this being implemented, and if so, can you shed some light on this matter?
Yes, the migrant health policy is having several areas. One is the outbound Sri Lankan migrant workers and their family members. In terms of the outbound migrant workers, the present day topic that the Sri Lankans live in the country, their health status at the pre-departure level, we call it pre-departure health assessment, is a mandatory requirement, and the Bureau of Foreign Employment and the Health Ministry is now involved as a joint committee to look at this credibility and the aspects of this pre-departure level health assessment. On the top of this health assessment, what we have understood, the leave-in migrant workers are healthy and they are fit for overseas employment. From that point, what we need to understand, they need to come back to the country with the same health condition. So to ensure that they are coming back to the country with the same health, or they are working in the destination country with that good health, so what we need to do in the pre-departure and at the post-arrival and on stay work stay period. For that, we are ensuring, so we are taking as a health insurance policy as a mandatory requirement, because at the destination countries, the workers' health is to be looked after by the employer, to look after the the employee's health conditions, the employer must have an insurance policy, health insurance policy. So it is a mandatory requirement at the pre-departure level. So without having a health insurance, we don't approve any licensed agent or any migrant worker who is leaving the country in a self way to a destination country.
But
so
how can you monitor whether a migrant worker actually has, gets access to medication in situations of an illness? Or
yeah, that's for their general health, of course. The employer has to, the worker has to report or they inform the employer that they are in the ill health condition. They are being given an special card. With that card they can go to their hospital, and that proves they have the health insurance, so they can get the medication.
Yeah,
so
but
those are being taken place by now. If there is any violation or the employer is not supporting for the to look after the employee's health, then they can complain us. Then the embassy, the labor section can contact the employer.
Mangal, you made a very important point. You said that if the employer is not giving access to medical health, if they are being ill-treated, they can contact you. But you would agree with me if I say, most often than not, the cases that we hear are the cases of individuals who have been in detention in certain houses for over 10-12 years, and when they get a small opportunity, they just run away from those houses in question. And you can't really expect that to happen. Can there be like a routine visit by a ambassador or a high commissioner or individuals from your end go and visit certain houses and ask about the well-being? Is that practical? Because you need to have a practical system in place.
Yeah, how it is practical that by an individual or an officer can make in visits to the individual workplace? So that's impractical. That cannot be done. What is practical is ensuring from the employer's point. Like, employer must ensure the employee's well-being. So that's a mandatory requirement. No individual can continuously monitor whether the employee is being given their health, the health being looked after. So what we do, we have made this as a mandatory requirement at the pre-departure level. So we do have all the health insurance policies, the policy documents, the copy of the policy, and we can, from that point, we can monitor it when they complain to the Bureau of Foreign Employment or to the mission that their health is not being looked after by the employer. There are incidents where the reports come in or the complaints come into the Bureau, and we have the separate section of conciliation. The officers involved in contacting employers and persuading them, and the talking them directly.
Let's say Sri Lankan houseman comes to Sri Lanka and says, this employer ill-treated me. What happens next?
So, having come back to the country and complaining, of course, we can admit the complaint, but we can't do any action against.
Okay, let me rephrase that question.
Yeah, because once the exit is given by the employer, we should know it, because when the exit is...
Let me rephrase that. Let's say the Sri Lankan domestic worker goes to the embassy and says, this employer has ill-treated me. What are the instances in which the Sri Lankan government or the embassy in question has taken action against the employer in question?
There are several incidents, and we can give enough evidence where the Sri Lankans report into the embassy and come into the safe house and claiming that the employer has harassed or not treated, so that then the embassy has the power to summon the relevant agent to the embassy. Then from the agent, the employer also can be summoned to the embassy, and the matter can be taken in front of the employer.
What are the instances in which there has been some sort of compensation given out to the Sri Lankan domestic workers? Has there been instances?
So many incidences. There are enough. there are enough. From the getting the compensation from the employer, getting the compensation from the agent, so a lot of incidents are there. I can of course give the statistics wise.
Mangala, you spoke about how it is not possible to visit each and every household to check. I agree with you, but the embassy officials don't even have a map to the location, because a few hours ago you said that in Philippines you have the maps given out to the embassies in question. Okay, your domestic worker is being stationed in this place, so you know exactly how to go to this location in question. And Sri Lanka does not even have that system in place.
Sri Lanka is implementing that system. So we got that information from the Philippines, where the individual contract is being attested at the embassy labor section. We take the residents and their individual the nationals, the identifications, and all the details being taken by the embassy before we attest the particular the agreement which is given by the employer. So the details are available. From that details, of course, we have searched with the governorate assistance of the destination country to the places where Sri Lankans been kept enforced.
So all good measures going to be implemented in the near future, but not yet implemented. Is this all enough? Are we doing enough as a nation, as a country?
No, we're not doing enough. There's a lot more we can do.
What can we do? You can give some advice to Mangal, who's sitting just next to you right now.
In fact, we do work closely together. And we support the Foreign Employment Bureau in establishing mechanisms, especially at the diplomatic mission level. In fact, something like vetting foreign recruitment agents is something we are going to be working on within the next year. Thereby, we look at foreign recruitment agents, of course, along with the government, who have had issues before, and we sort of make sure they're not in the process anymore. But I'd like to also touch on something that Sonali said on using technology. Something that the ILO is working with the International Trade Union Federation is something called the Migrant Recruit Monitor. And this is where, almost like TripAdvisor, where one is able to write a review on a particular recruitment agent in a particular country. It's accessible to workers, and there are so many migrant workers who are now savvy in terms of using WhatsApp, Skype, Viber. I've personally spoken to several people in many of the districts in Sri Lanka who use these forms of communication. A smartphone is an absolute necessity now, as we all know.
Sonali, you said something interesting in your previous statement. You said the government needs to care. Does the business community in Sri Lanka care? Because, I mean, after all, a lot of these people are traveling overseas looking for employment because they can't find decent paying jobs in Sri Lanka, because wages here in comparison with the cost of living are not quite on par. What is the business community in Sri Lanka doing? Where is the space for them to operate? Should they be increasing wages? Is it a possibility for them to be increasing wages to entice people to stay here?
Nadeem, brain drain is a massive issue. That's right, absolutely right.
But this is not necessarily brain drain either, because this is not skilled migration. This is people going for work as domestic aids. Their options here are working in working as low-skilled labor. But working as low-skilled labor here will get them less than half of what they get as migrant workers.
Can I ask you a question? Would you pay 35,000 rupees for a domestic worker here? We have the responsibility as well here.
Right, okay.
I mean, we do talk about modern day slavery, so we're talking about countries in the Middle East, but we can't ignore the fact that, you know, to a certain degree, it's probably happening in Sri Lanka as well. There's a large informal sector. We do have a lot of people working as housemaids in Sri Lanka, Sri Lankans working as housemaids in Sri Lanka, and well, to a lesser degree now, but we have heard horror stories in the past of the abuse that they have suffered at the hands of their masters.
Nadeem, that's a multi-pronged question, so I'm going to take my time answering it. I spoke about brain drain, so yes, in addition to the entry-level, low-skilled workers, there's also the multi-skilled workers who travel overseas because of a lack of proper job opportunities in Sri Lanka. So providing the necessary alternatives is the responsibility of the government mainly. However, moving on to your next question, it is not just the responsibility of the government. Society has also the responsibility as a stakeholder to ensure that we engage these workers as well.
Sorry, I have a very quick question for you. You asked Nadeem whether we are willing to pay 35,000 rupees, but if you really know, Sri Lankans pay 25,000 rupees for a domestic worker in a particular month. Now that's the going rate in Sri Lanka. It's 20 to 25,000 rupees, and we're talking about just 10,000 less. This information the domestic worker does not know. They're not aware. They always think that there is always a better life in another country. So this is where the government comes into play. This is where the ILO comes into play. This is where the IOM comes into play. This is where all the civil rights activists come into play. Don't you agree with me?
I agree, and this is where the Convention 189, it doesn't talk only about domestic workers overseas, it also talks about domestic workers within Sri Lanka. So definitely in terms of if there were opportunities where people were paying 35,000 rupees or more, and people here, the prospective domestic workers knew about it, perhaps they would decide to stay back with their families. I don't think it's an easy choice for them to go. At the same time, not all, some people are actually escaping issues within their families, issues of violence. So it's not always very clear cut. There are a lot of underlying issues as well.
Sorry, Nadeem, I need to complete answering that question you earlier asked. Now the context of the business involvement is changing. The world has rejected this whole establishmentarian movement. Businesses are fast becoming one of the most powerful stakeholders, which is why this year even the Bali Process included businesses, right? So yes, businesses have a massive role to play in ensuring ethical recruitment and all the other factors that we spoke of in the beginning of the show, Nadeem.
Do you see this happening with businesses in Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. Businesses, I mean, we've seen how businesses, how the corporate sector has come forward, even with regard to programs like Gammadda, which have just taken out the government, which is supposed to engage in reconstruction projects, etc. Right? And businesses have really converged in ensuring that corporate social responsibility is really done unto the final customer.
Dr. Pilesha, IPS warned of increasing inequality in Sri Lanka in June last year. The trend has not really been arrested. While the economy is growing, the wealth gap is also growing. Do you agree with Sonali that business is doing its part to keep workers from taking low-skilled jobs in foreign countries?
To a large extent, yes, the businesses are doing a great job, but then there is this expectations of the workers also. Now Sri Lanka has moved into a middle income economy, and there are greater expectations that people want to have certain things, certain income levels, and then when they can't meet it within the country despite the efforts by the private sector, so they will look at greener pastures overseas.
Why is it that they can't meet these expectations within the country? Like, for example, let's say domestic workers, we're talking about 25,000 and 35,000. Sri Lanka is a middle income country. Is it a case of 35,000?
As you said, it's inequality. There's a huge gap, so the people who have will have a lot, and the others.
How do you address this gap? I mean, we're getting into political ideologies here of socialism and capitalism, etc. But this is a serious problem. It's one of the reasons that you're having a large number of migrants traveling overseas every year, which is one of the reasons why when the Korean examinations happen, we see people crowding the streets, massive queues. They're all trying to get out because they can't earn a decent wage in their country. How do you address this huge problem?
It's a multifaceted problem. You have to have a multifaceted approach also to address it. So to begin with, you have to create opportunities within the country. So maybe the government can't do it alone. The private sector has to bring in investment, start businesses, and right now the trend is like everybody is trying to get into financial sector, and very little production is done. Without physical production, where can you go? You need some sort of things really taking place also. So the private sector can do a lot of work in that area rather than giving out loans. And this, I think earlier Sonali mentioned about debt bondage. To an extent, this is also driving Sri Lankan people out of the country, because the emerging financial sector throws out money, offers money as loans, and then these people, when it is offered, they just take it very gladly, but then they don't have a payment mechanism. And lots of people, especially in the eastern province, are falling into this trap, and now they're seeking foreign employment to get out of this debt trap. So the private sector also has a role to play back in not creating unwanted, giving out unwanted loans also.
Sorry, very quickly, I just was reading this article about modern slavery last evening, and it says that there are 27 million slaves in the world today, and it says that slaves work in fields, brothels, homes, mines, restaurants, and they're working most of them are working in India and in the African region. Now, this is a very alarming number. We're talking about 27 million slaves, modern slaves that are working in countries, and it says that it's impossible to end slavery even after 25 years. Why?
I think it's also to do with the fact that everything is hidden. Things remain underground, and as a result, there's also a fear psychosis in terms of people coming out and openly reporting on slavery. There's, I think, the fact that people are looking for greener pastures because of climate issues and conflict-related issues, and they're becoming desperate and as a result more vulnerable. It's the gap between the poor, the haves and the have-nots is increasing. Again, we talked of attitudes and how we look at migrant workers as a whole, as well as how we treat irregular migrants, be they within our own country and some, in other countries of destination as well.
Thank you very much, the ladies and the gentlemen, for your thoughts in the first, second, third and fourth rounds. We now go for a short commercial break, but before that, we give an opportunity to Charita.
Swari, last question to you. Some migrant groups have labeled Sri Lankan government's approach to our migrant workers as a commodity supply approach. They say the formula is to select, train, pack, insure and export with little imperative to protect workers. So Sonali also mentioned that governments need to care. Do you see this approach of our government, do you see this care factor improving, increasing?
Of course. I mean, I've worked with the sector for more than 6 years, and over this period I have seen protection mechanisms increase, efforts for sharing safe migration information at the very local level increase. For example, we have at each divisional secretariat level, the Ministry of Foreign Employment has 3 development officers who are tasked with sharing safe migration information, following up on families of migrant workers. So over the years, apart from enhancing pre-departure training and enhancing their skills and knowledge before they leave, there's also mechanisms going further than the district level. The Bureau has 25 district level officers, but now there are officials working to provide people more information and safeguards that we talked about at the local DS level. So I think there's 1,000+ such officers working in Sri Lanka, and that's a huge resource we have, which we are also working with currently.
Right then, we're going for a short commercial break. Chat the done. We're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. This is Face the Nation. Stay connected. Stay with us. We will be right back.